Welcome. I am talking this week on our YouTube show host series about something that I keep seeing show hosts in the personal brand podcast, talk show, chat show space ask about and feel not confident about. And as you know, if you've been watching our channel in this series, I'm really invested in helping podcast show hosts who are personal brands, who do have a lot to share, feel confident about what they are creating, because it's human nature to be very comparison focused. And to state the obvious, if you have a well-known personal brand in 2023, you probably struggle with comparison because social media is built for that. So I want to address something that I keep seeing come up with my clients and with podcasters at large. Like, I read a lot of the podcast industry news and I kind of have my finger on the pulse across the different types of shows. So yes, I'm speaking to you if you're a podcast host who's also a personal brand, but I'm talking to probably anybody who's creating media that they own and are distributing on their own platform. It's very different if you're, an actor or you have a TV talk show and there's a huge network behind you who's validated you and signed off and been like, this person's worth giving a show to. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of this confidence challenge, and hopefully it'll give you perspective so that if you've been feeling that insecurity or comparisonitis, it will help alleviate that. Okay, the confidence issue that I'm talking about that I constantly hear from podcast hosts who are personal brands is like, if I don't do it like someone else is doing it who's very successful, am I going to fail? And they don't say it that way, right? I hear it between what they're not saying. That's the core question. And sometimes it'll show up as like, hey, should we do this thing that I saw someone else doing? Like, that's the email that will show up in our inbox. Or a client will say, hey, how's my show doing? They won't ask like, hey, how many downloads do we have? Is it growing? What else can I do to connect with my ideal listener? They'll just be like, hey, how's my show doing? And reading between the lines, what I know they're really asking is like, am I good enough? Am I doing it the right way? Are people getting it? Do I look dumb? So let me give you a couple examples to help you understand why you should feel confident as a show host, regardless of whether you are doing your show the way other successful podcasters are doing their shows. And this is a bit of a perspective check, but it's also really strategic to focus on how to rank your confidence, regardless of what other people are doing. Okay. Everybody in the podcast world right now has noticed Strikeforce 5, which is the limited series podcast that 5 of the main late night talk show hosts put on during the writer's strike while their teams were on strike and couldn't work, to raise money for their teams to help cover salaries that were not being paid during the strike. So Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Fallon, Jimmy Kimmel, Seth Meyers, and John Oliver had a lot of time of the 5 months during the writer's strike, and they just hopped on remote recording laptops and recorded kind of hour-long conversations that a really great editor turned into a podcast via Spotify. And it was sponsored by a couple of brands that are owned by Ryan Reynolds, so they always thank him for his sponsorship. And literally, it was a fundraising project to try and help cover the salaries of their teams while they were on strike. So you can imagine that these 5 comedic late night TV talk show hosts, who all have over a decade of experience hosting their shows, were pretty entertaining. And they only planned on doing 12 episodes. Like, the whole intention of it was to be a limited series while they had the time and were in this unique situation. And it's done super well. It's been at the top of the charts. Obviously, if you're a fan of even one of those talk show hosts, you are probably listening because it feels like this great comedic insight. They tell a bunch of funny stories and razz each other and tease each other on the show, but they also tell lots of interesting stories behind the scenes of their careers. Okay. The reason I'm telling you about Strikeforce 5 is because it would be so easy to think like, oh my gosh, like, I can't be a good comedic podcast host if I'm not a super successful late night TV talk show host? Because clearly the networks that produced each of these talk shows put their stamp of approval on these talk show hosts to even have a job, right? And they talk about this in their show. They tell the stories of like how they got their jobs and what they were doing before and, you know, what people thought of them. So they're coming, it's interesting to see these like extremely veteran, extremely backed TV talk show hosts come on a podcast because they're on the podcast for fun and they're like, we can say whatever we want because there's no network behind us that, you know, we have to, ratings and things like that they have to abide by. And obviously like things you can't say on TV, you could say on a podcast. So it's been kind of a great insight, I think, listening as a podcast producer, to hear talk show hosts who have the seal of approval from major TV networks who are super conscious about brand safety and hear them on a podcast and they are just having the time of their lives. They're like, this is so free and creative and fun. Obviously, they have a great editor who kind of made it listenable because you can imagine how much talking over they did. But that's, I think, what I want you to take confidence from. Like, you do not have to do those TV talk show host jobs. They are under so much pressure and they have such a public eye on them for every word they say on their shows every night. And for them to be able to just hop on a podcast and be like, oh my gosh, we can just like catch up and tease each other and tell stories. And it is such a good example of the freedom you have to be yourself on a podcast that many other media outlets don't allow. TV shows are very restrictive. Radio shows are restrictive for a whole different set of reasons. Timing, what you can say, who your partners are, the affiliates of the network that you can't speak out against. Like the amount of things that you could say like, oh, well, why would I even start a show? I'm not this professional show host. Well, podcasting offers an entirely different arena. And you can shine and you can connect with an audience in a very different way than you ever could on a TV show. So that's example number one. Take confidence from the fact that even the most seasoned talk show host pros have a totally different vibe and persona on a podcast because there's freedom. Okay, second story I want you to consider when you're dealing with like confidence issues as a podcast host. There is something that you can share with your audience, the audience who specifically is interested in what you're talking about, whether you're interviewing people or doing solo shows or educational style shows. Be confident that your audience wants to learn from you. Now, you may have a really niche audience, like it may be super specific or it may be broad. But once you figure out who's listening and who wants to listen, and that could be through word of mouth, through the DMs you're getting, the emails, the texts, the messages, the conversation with friends, when anybody tells you that they listen to your show, that is a great time to get feedback about like who listens, like who is my audience. Once you realize who your audience is, you have full permission to just serve them, speak to them, help them, share information with them. It's really not about serving other people's audiences in podcasting. Like you or your show's not going to get canceled because you didn't get enough ratings like a TV show. You're in a whole other world in podcasting. Like literally there are no gatekeepers. You can say something crazy offensive or deemed, erroneous, false, harmful. If you say something really nasty that would harm someone, your show could get taken down by the apps. But outside of that, there's no canceling your show by some bigger entity. So you can speak to your niche audience and serve them in the way that you know they need it. And that will be a massively successful show within your niche that has nothing to do with someone else's audience and trying to like bring people over that really aren't into your show. What I'm trying to help you realize is that your confidence as a show host can come from realizing you have the freedom to be yourself and actually speak pretty unfettered, for lack of a better word, on a podcast. And you can serve your niche audience in a really special, valuable way and has nothing to do with what anyone else is doing on their podcast, on their platforms, on their social media, on the clips they cut, on their YouTube channel. Like, you can stare at what other people are doing all day long, but it will never get you moving forward in your show if you are about something else. Like, yes, you can admire someone, but come back home at the end of the day and be like, well, what do I have to say that will serve my audience, that I have the freedom to say because I'm on this media platform that is relatively unrestricted? And I hope you take that in the way that I mean it, right? Like, yes, make quality content, think through what you're sharing, edit yourself, be digestible, and don't just rant on without any thought about what you're saying. But take heart in the fact that you've been given the privilege of broadcasting your message literally to the world with no barrier, and that you serving your niche audience will be so much more successful than trying to focus on what someone else is doing and copycat them, because their audience is not your audience. And the size of the audience is far less important than the quality of relationship you're building with them. And that really comes from the quality of your episodes. So that's my thought for today. Hopefully that helps you with comparisonitis if you've been struggling with confidence as a show host, or feeling like you need to do what everyone else does, that maybe your show is not good enough. Come back to the incredible opportunity you have to broadcast literally your messages, and focus on your niche audience and share with them in a way that you only can on a podcast, and keep them top of mind. And your show will do far better than you could have imagined. Okay, that's my tip for the day. Subscribe to our channel. We're dropping weekly videos, and we'd love to help you become a better show host.